Pat, I'd like to talk a little bit about the topic of social sin, and I'm hoping that you can address that from some of your own perspectives as a student of English literature, as a teacher, and of all forms of literature, including black literature. I want to look at it from the viewpoint of the theological categories and more philosophical ones. Social sin suggests that institutions can be unjust and can dehumanize people. Institutions often then produce their own legitimating symbols. They produce an ideology or a rationalization for why they function the way they do. And then what seems to happen is that people drink in this message. Human beings who live in a culture have an imaginative grid that's formed by the cultural symbols that are prevalent. And so we begin to produce what commentators have called false consciousness. So I want to talk about social sin and false consciousness. I trace that back at least as far as the philosopher Hegel, and it was really brought out in other existentialist thinkers in the 20th century, Jean Paul Sartre being a good example of talking about false ways of viewing the world and misplaced apprehensions and so on. And so maybe we again need some sort of concrete example of that, but if you live in the United States, it's easy to end up thinking that our standards of goodness or the way the world should run are the only ways of seeing it, so that nationalism can become a sort of false consciousness. One is able to think the United States is always right in every situation, or other cultures really are inferior compared to ours, and so on. So let's begin to explore a little bit of this whole idea of false consciousness. I know it certainly comes out in literature a lot. A lot of times literature would be based on the idea that there's people in there who are unenlightened or don't see what's happening or don't perceive the reality of what's going on. And part of the plot of the literature, I suppose, would be to help them to come to some deeper awareness of the flawed way they had seen the world before. Do you want
right.
to... I was hoping for a little fuller.
For a little, yes, a little.
I was hoping for a little fuller
that.
Response than that.
Right. Well, you are right, and we are in a fascinating period of a flowering of literature from minority persons of all sorts in the country. Yeah, we could certainly start with some African American literature. People like Richard Wright and James Baldwin, who told their story. Maya Angelou, who tells her story in a number of autobiographical works. We also have Native Americans now increasingly telling their stories and indicating the difficulty of, first of all, being stretched between two different cultures, but also telling the stories of the oppression and discrimination which they have experienced. Recently I finished reading Lakota Woman, for instance. And among other things, Mary Crow Dog talks about how systematically, when groups from the reservation would go into town, they would be surrounded and harassed and often beat up on by the white people within that community. And it sounded very much like stories that African Americans tell about systematically simply being discounted, being objects of mockery, being in a sense the scapegoats of our need apparently to feel, we being white people, feel somehow that we are superior to other groups of people.
So what happens effectively is that the oppressed groups that you've mentioned there end up thinking about themselves even in inferior ways. In other words, their self-esteem is destroyed. I've talked to people who have taught on Indian reservations, taught Native Americans, and we'll speak about that, of how fragile their self-confidence is and how they must be so careful to try to build up their self-esteem, and that one way of thinking of what has happened is they have simply ingested the stereotypical thinking of the dominant community. They've made it their own. In other words, after being treated as being inferior or banished to the margins over a period of time, one begins to think like that's where I belong, or that's how I ought to be treated. And we can see that in so many different examples of male-female relationships, for example, or minorities in relationship to the dominant culture, or one religious group vis-a-vis another religious group. So that false consciousness is partly predicated on the fact that our identity is fragile, is weak, is limited, and that it's hard to sustain it, to keep it alive, to keep self-confidence really flourishing. And I believe that, what we're seeing there is the people who are put down begin to think of themselves fundamentally as inferior.
That's hard to overcome, and we all know that, because I suspect that a sense of inadequacy is perhaps the original sin, is what all of us struggle with in the course of our lives. And we know how one comment by one teacher at a certain grade when we were in school can play through our mind for all the rest of our lives, and constantly with a sense of our being somehow unworthy, not up to a particular standard. And when this is believed to be thought by most of the people in the culture that we are inherently inferior, I'm not really sure. Certainly it's a challenge. It's a challenge.
Of course, the first thing about false consciousness, as we've, I think, learned in our own time, is that you must raise consciousness. That's become the device of so many groups within modern society, to say we must look at this. People don't see themselves adequately. They don't understand their own situation really, and therefore there must be prophetic figures or enlightened people or teachers who are able to raise consciousness. Now, many of us have seen that happen in relationship to male-female relationships, or the role of women in our society. I often bring this example out of how many times women, for example, sang songs or hymns in church which were sexist and grew out of a patriarchal setting and used only masculine imagery or male pronouns, and never noticed it. It never noticed it. They weren't offended by it. They weren't hurt by it. It just was there and accepted and became part of what we would call false consciousness in this context. And only after someone would begin to question it, or raise the question, or raise consciousness, as we say, would people begin to notice this, that this has really destructive effects, that to be excluded linguistically over and over, you begin to think like you are excluded, or ought to be excluded, or are properly set to the sidelines.
A similar example might be that until, and it's younger people won't relate to this, but certainly while I was growing up, all commercials, all ads in magazines only had white persons in them. We did not see black candidates for beauty pageants, for instance, for Miss America pageants. We didn't see the faces of minority people in billboards, for instance. So in a sense, in a very real sense, Ralph Ellison's image of the invisible man and woman certainly played out, that minority people could go through magazine after magazine and look on television in its early days and never find an image of themselves. In a sense, they did not exist.
Did you ever see that study? Well, when they did with black dolls and white dolls for little black girls? Well, that's the famous study that was done in relationship to a Supreme Court decision and or case, and they were trying to prove the deleterious effects of racism and of prejudice, and so that little black girls would tend to play with white dolls or prefer white dolls, and when asked which one was prettier or more beautiful, they would point to the white dolls as being prettier or more attractive or more desirable. A telling example of false consciousness which enters into one's thinking at a very early age. And again, what you're getting there is the power of the culture,
That's right.
the power of social sin to influence the way we think. I often use that phrase that we have imaginative grids through which we view our world. Those grids are created by the world in which we live. They come from the society, from the culture as a whole. The symbols, the images of the culture become our lenses for viewing reality, the glasses through which we see what is going on. And those will be shaped, and we will perceive only what the glasses allow us to see. And that is really telling. again, it can sound very remote maybe, but we all have to look at ourselves in those ways. I mean, in what ways are my lenses limited? The glasses I use, what do they reveal to me, but what do they blind me to? What is ruled out of what I see because of the cultural symbols that have shaped my consciousness? You could probably think of examples. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say James Baldwin used on many occasions the expression willed innocence in relation to racism. And he said the problem was that white people did not know and did not want to know the effects of their attitudes on black people, what they had done to black people in this country. I thought it was a very interesting phrase. You know, we're familiar with the phrase inculpable ignorance, ignorance that we can't really help, something that we don't know but we couldn't be expected to know. But he referred to this as willed innocence, and I think that's a useful phrase. You know, are there areas in which I can become informed, in which I can examine more carefully what life is like for people that I simply do not encounter, but who are a part of the society and part of what supposedly is the melting pot or the mosaic or whatever image we want to use of it.
I think we need to look at the way this false consciousness can affect the minority groups in another way, both dominant groups and minority groups in the culture, both men and women. So we've looked at it and said, well, minorities could ingest the attitude of the culture and look down on themselves, lose self-esteem, lose self-confidence. Native Americans being a good example of this. But the thing can be reversed as well. That is, there can be a way in which the minority groups have false pictures of the dominant group as well. I remember when during the Los Angeles riots, Ted Koppel did an interview with a lot of blacks. In fact, he seemed like he was the only white person, at least on camera, in the whole auditorium. And it was an evening thing, and it really got pretty hot and heavy. And he was taking a lot of flack and for what was going on and so on. And at one point, he stopped a woman and said, now look, he said, it was a black woman, he said, if you are going to lump all of us whites together, you know, you are making a big mistake. You cannot lump us all together as being racist in this context. And he says, you will do better to make more careful judgments along the line. He really called her to task. And I think that it was an example of how the minority group can end up doing the same sort of thing. And this often leads, I think, to destructive behavior then from all sides, but from within the minority group itself.
That's a good point. That's a helpful point for us. Now, so often if we have met one person who represents a subset, we generalize about all the people in that subset, which is not fair. And then when we meet one other person, we assume in that subset, we assume things that well may not be true of that person. And so you're exactly right that the misconceptions don't necessarily come in the part of the dominant culture. They can also come in the part
the other way.
Yes, that's right.
And then you get a sort of fear on the part of the dominant culture. I've talked to people lately, successful white males in the culture, who talk about being at conferences and so on, where they are portrayed as the out group, that they're the all they are is manipulators and dominators, and they don't know anything, and before long, by the year 2000, they're going to be a minority group in any corporation or any structure in the society and so on, and the day of the minorities is coming. And so you get, interestingly enough, educated, white, successful males feeling beleaguered in many ways. Feeling like, well, how are we supposed to function in this world? Why are everyone looking down on us? What did we do? We're trying to do good things in this world.
The patriarchal bastards, right?
Well, this is how people end up feeling.
Sure.
And so that it cuts a number of different ways, it seems to me, that this false consciousness and faulty way of viewing how people function and who they really are. And so what you end up getting is a lot of fear on all sides and a lot of, I'd say, unenlightened behavior. I was thinking of that too, Pat, in terms of when you don't get that right, and when false consciousness takes us over, then we really are in danger of all kind of destructive and violent behavior. So you could take blacks, say, in the inner city, who are imprisoned in an unjust system, unemployment rates tremendously high, and not a lot of hope for getting out of all of this, and then you get a Rodney King kind of decision, and then you got a flare-up. And you could say this becomes somehow a justification for violence. And then you get this terrible, destructive black-on-black violence, and people who spend all their years building up their own store or working out a business or raising a family in the fairly decent surroundings, that's suddenly destroyed. And somehow the premise is around that, well, this group of oppressed people, had some legitimate way of being violent. The violence didn't get perpetrated on the rest of the society. Yeah. It ended up messing up their own neighborhoods.
Yeah. That's so tricky, Jim. It's the problem of the man who, we see an example of this on a domestic level in Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin, which is his first autobiographical novel. His father was a preacher, but also had a job in a white company, and apparently was subject to a lot of oppression there and discrimination, and this built up in him a lot of rage. Well, he couldn't take it out on his bosses because he would have lost his job, and he had a large family, so instead he came home and, in the name of righteousness and in the name of religion, really took out his rage on all the other members in the family. He was a very, very stern man, and in a sense they became the outlet, the scapegoats, the victims of his anger, because he was not able to express his rage to those who had caused it. And we see something on a larger scale, of course, in Los Angeles. Do we justify it? Well, it's just I think it just raises for us the questions of what happens to a dream deferred. Langston Hughes' poem. Eventually it explodes, and it's going to explode where the dream was deferred, which means that the spill is going to be on others who are around me at the time that the fury, can't be contained anymore. This is tragic. I'm not sure what else to say about it except that it's tragic. There's a certain psychological, understandability in it as well, I guess.
Well, there's no doubt that it's tragic. I mean, I would like to, if you look concretely at the Los Angeles riots, there's a lot of suggestion that it really wasn't a matter just of anger at what was going on, and it wasn't just blacks involved. There were Hispanics involved, or other minority groups involved, and it was there was just a lot more going on than just anger. In other words, when they interviewed some of these looters or were talking to people and so on, it almost had sort of a festive character to it. It had some other dynamic going on and not just rage. But I guess the point I would make is that false consciousness can mess us up, produce destructive behavior. That might be understandable. There's some people who were angry about that decision, angry about their life, and don't have hope. I would link it more not to anger, but to lack of hope. Like, how would we ever get out of here? How would we ever get a job? How would you ever make a life for yourself or protect your kids? I link it with lack of hope, and then striking out for just in any way because one doesn't care much anymore because the system won't work for one. I can link it to that. But my point here, it seems to me, is that there has to be we have to attack false consciousness, whether it's in the dominant group or in the minority groups. In either case, it is self-destructive, and I think it needs to be challenged.
Well, I want to go back to anger. Lack of hope, that would lead, I think, to massive depression. But at the same time, that decision to vindicate those officers, were I black, I would clearly see that as a vindication for black bashing anywhere and in any situation. You know, I
So what's your response going to be?
rage.
Hurt other black people who live next to you?
I'm not sure, and I don't know that I can say, because I was not in that situation.
Well,
but
none
certainly
of us
it would be
were.
more than depression. It would be more than a loss of hope. It would be an active and vehement rage, and that rage would inevitably find some kind of expression. Now,
Well,
maybe I
surely
would
you
have
saw
smacked
some-
my children around.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
No. Well, I don't think any of us know when we're in
Yeah.
crisis situations how we would really end up acting. I mean, I don't think that it's possible to know that, and it's frightening to think of how one might react and go against one's own ideals. But when you try to do a cultural analysis or try to understand what's happening, I think that one has to look at all of the factors that are going. I think if you watch the television interviews or people that they talk to afterwards, it wasn't so much rage. I mean, you did get some of that, but you got also all other kinds of motivations that are involved in the thing. You got just take advantage of the situation,
Oh,
or
certainly.
a lark,
Yeah, sure.
or just
Sure.
grab up what you can right now. So I mean, I think it's complicated, but the false consciousness analysis helps us to see the destructive character of not seeing things clearly. The way around that, it seems to me, is to try to get over that kind of stereotypical thinking that might have become now part and parcel of one's outlook on the world. And how do we move beyond that? Again, I think education might be one of the ways we would try to do that. I think we'd have to try to see how prevalent false consciousness is. I mean, nobody avoids it. I mean, we can sit here and say, well, we're enlightened, but that isn't true. I mean, I'm sure there's things we hold right now that people years from now will say, my heavens, those people were crazy. They used to think like this. I mean, that we just are not able to see. I mean, how many of us have been through that in terms of male-female relationships? Or United States interests versus what the cultures around the world, or Christianity versus other religions. How much false consciousness is involved right within biblical religion, for example? Within Christianity, there's all kind of anti-Semitic ideologies. In other words, you can, in Matthew's Gospel, I mean, whenever a Pharisee comes up to Jesus, they're tempting Jesus. Not every time, but there's a lot of situations where the inquiries are not honest, as you might find in Mark's Gospel, but they are trying to trap Jesus. And the Jews, the very word Jews is used in a pejorative sense. No attempt to sort out people who were for Jesus or against him, or leaders who were responsible for, in part at least, in his death, and the people as a whole. No nuanced judgment, just the Jews, somehow bad people. So we end up with a ideology or a false consciousness right within the New Testament itself. And I think that often goes unexamined, or we're just not willing to look at it. And what social sin analysis forces us to start to think like that. I don't care whether it's patriarchy in the Bible, sexist approaches within the Bible. The Bible itself has to be looked at in terms of possibly producing false consciousness. Now, that's a hard saying for some people to accept, but I think if you just start to look at the way it's written and many things in there, one can begin to see the power of that analysis.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I suspect that another subgroup that we have not yet referred to, about which a false consciousness is emerging, is the Japanese, who we see as threatening us economically right now. And a lot of the kinds of comments that are being made about the Japanese certainly are building up, starting to build up again a mythos that's going to, I'm afraid, have really destructive consequences to Japanese American persons, or people coming over here.
I've heard lectures talk about that situation in relationship to the when Pearl Harbor was bombed. The Americans could not believe that they were being bombed by the Japanese. Some claimed it was the Germans who were somehow using Japanese planes or camouflaged the planes. We had military commanders who for a long period of time refused to accept that on stereotypical thinking that the Japanese were not bright enough, not good enough, not intelligent enough to really ever be able to pull off an attack like that. It's an example
Yes.
of what you're talking about, and it's getting resurrected in various ways.
Yes, yes.
Well, do you have any other examples that you're seeing here that you want to use in terms of this false consciousness kind of thing?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I suspect there's a false consciousness that's connected to homophobia, to the fear of gay people, to a lot of assumptions that somehow if a teacher is gay, the teacher may be more likely, for instance, to put it very bluntly, to be a child molester or to give AIDS to the students. And so I think that this needs to be examined very, very carefully. Again, despite a lot of enlightenment regarding homosexuality and AIDS, which we are very fearful of right now, I do think that there is also a cluster of myths that cling to homosexuals.
And we would often talk about that then as homophobia.
That's
One
right.
ends up somehow fearing the members of the gay community.
That's right.
Well, Pat, we've been talking here about social sin, and we're looking at social sin as residing in institutions and structures, and saying that sometimes systems are unjust and they produce their own legitimating ideologies, symbols, which try to show that this injustice is all right, that it's on target. And then what we find is that both oppressors and oppressed drinking in this false consciousness. They drink in the symbols. It becomes the grid through which we look at the world. And it creates all kind of destructive behavior, whether you look at it in terms of urban riots or homophobia, as you pointed out, or nationalism. All of these ways we don't see the world clearly, and because of that we involve ourselves often in destructive behavior.